So this video is going to explore the revolutionary ideas that played a significant role in challenging the existing order. And just to refresh, the existing order in America was that they were subservient to the British, that everything they did was to increase Britain's revenue and wealth, and however they were considered British citizens. So we're going to start with this idea and talk just a little recap of the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta and the British Bill of Rights were both documents created in England long before the American Revolution itself. But these documents were important because they limited the power of the monarch or the king, and they gave citizens more rights. And these rights included personal rights. Before this, the king could basically pass whatever tax he wanted and do whatever he wanted to the citizens of Britain. But after a few wars and nasty run-ins, they changed these laws. So here is an example of what the Magna Carta says. It says that no free man shall be taken, imprisoned, deceased, outlawed, banished, or in any way destroyed, nor will we, and it's a capital we there because it's the royal we, proceed against or prosecute him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. So it's talking about how all citizens now have the right to their freedom and should not be persecuted without fair judgment or through law. It also says that to no one will they sell or deny or delay right or justice. So these ideas that everyone has basic rights, and specifically legal rights, really underpinned what the Americans thought that they had. So because they believed they had the rights of all British citizens, even though many of them were not born in Britain, had never been to Britain, they felt they should have those rights. Now, the Magna Carta is not actually on the study design, but it's a good thing to throw in occasionally. What is on the study design are these ideas, which are really come under the umbrella of a period of time known as Enlightenment. So we're going to talk about republicanism and liberty and representative government, but none of these things would exist without the Enlightenment period. So it's really helpful to think of it as an umbrella, Enlightenment, and these ideas come beneath it. So the Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason, and it is a period of time. It's a period of time from 1715 to 1789. And this, which is right, obviously, the revolution is smack bang in the middle of that in 76, or at the end. But it was a period of huge change in thought and reason that had a really significant impact on society as we know it today. Basically, they got rid of centuries of these customs and traditions, such as burning people because they were witches, and believing that monarchs were given their powers because of God, and not really questioning scientific things and thinking instead that they were acts of God or the result of witchcraft. So these ideas were brushed away in favor of individualism, which is we should have our own personal freedoms and not just be governed by the king. Tolerance, particularly religious tolerance, and the importance of science. One of the main things that came out of the Enlightenment was who has the right to make decisions for other people and govern other people, and how do the governed have a say in what their lives are. So it's a really important thing where a lot of people were outright rejecting monarchy, which was the prevailing system of leadership in most nations for a very long time. Enlightenment philosophers spoke of their desire for break from political tyranny. So tyranny is like a dictatorship, essentially, in today's words. But this idea that your king could do whatever he wanted and often could be quite violent and cruel, but it was okay because they were the king, and this was seen as no longer relevant or effective in terms of leadership. And it also spoke about how we have the rights, we have personal freedoms, And as individuals, these should not be abused by those in charge. So the Enlightenment is this period of time in which all of these ideas come from. So how might you talk about it in your SAC or your exam? You might say things like, Patrick Henry was inspired by Enlightenment ideas when he wrote the Virginia Resolves. So it's not something you have to ever really describe, but if you know what the ideas of Enlightenment are, and you can use it to say how it has influenced the colonists, that's what you need. So one of the leading philosophers during this Enlightenment period was John Locke, who was born in 1632 and died in 1704, but his writings inspired a lot of the Enlightenment movement, and his writings were found in essays. His biggest contribution to the world as we know it today is his idea of natural rights, which is the idea that people are entitled to certain privileges and basic freedoms simply because they exist. Because you are born, you deserve these 3 rights, and no one can take those rights from you. And the 3 natural rights that he outlines are life, which is the idea that everyone is entitled to live once they have been created, and you cannot infringe upon that by, say, murdering someone. Liberty, which is as long as you are not affecting anyone's life, you are entitled to do anything that you wish. And then finally we have estate, which is you can own anything that you make or earn, and it's specifically talking kind of about things that you can get monetarily, whether you're given it as a gift or if you earn it through trade, things like houses, your money, your savings, those things are yours and no one is entitled to it, as long as you're not then interrupting other people's life and liberty while you're trying to get estate. So for an example, slave owners, technically, they are earning quite a lot of money from the slaves. They own the slaves, but because that infringes upon their liberty and their life, they should not be entitled to estate. Another big theory that Locke had was this idea of social contract, which was we, as governed people, enter into a contract with our government where we say, as long as you do not infringe upon our rights, we consent to you making decisions for us. However, once it gets to the point where our rights are infringed upon, the people have the right to revolt against that government. So a metaphor would be, in the classroom, you do what I tell you to do because you know that you'll be getting an education from it. However, if I suddenly, start teaching you about something really random, like Mars or Pluto, then you can have a revolution against me because I'm no longer helping you with your right to a history education. Something else that he's really critical of is the monarchy generally, but specifically when the monarchy have a standing army. And so a standing army is when you have ready to go soldiers at your deployment. Locke sort of argues that why would you need soldiers unless you do not trust your people? And this is going to be a big idea that comes up because of the Quartering Act, and specifically in Boston in the early 1770s, we're going to see a lot of criticism of this standing army and the colonists saying, well, we're not fighting a war at the moment. Why are soldiers still here? And getting that feeling that perhaps they're there to keep the colonists obedient. So if we go back to that umbrella of enlightenment, we're not going to talk about John Locke anymore, but just some of the other revolutionary ideas that really developed during this period of time. So one we're going to talk about now is republicanism. And a republic is a form of government where elected officials are chosen by and represent their citizens to enforce laws and implement things like taxes. Today, it often refers to a government that doesn't have a monarchy. So republicanism is the philosophy that rejects monarchy and instead gives the power to the people. It argues that the people should have sovereignty or the right to choose what happens to them. And there's this idea that the people who are governed, so the citizens, should give their consent when a new law is passed for them. And the way that they do that is voting for the people to make the laws. So it's not arguing that every time a new law is introduced, we need a unanimous vote, but instead, by voting for our leaders, we are giving consent for them to make whatever decisions they feel will benefit us. So in terms of the revolution, Republicans were the people who were advocating for the 13 colonies to be separated from the British Parliament and from the British Empire in its entirety. The next idea in our Enlightenment umbrella that we're going to talk about is the idea of representative government. So representative government is a form of democracy, and it's sort of an indirect democracy. So direct democracy is our country needs to make a decision, and so every single person in the country is going to vote for that decision. An example, in our classroom, we are deciding whether we are going to do we're going to do a Kahoot or not. And I take a vote, and every single class member votes whether they want to do a Kahoot or they don't. Representative government is, instead of asking every single person, the class would select a leader to make those decisions. So you would vote for someone who would and then represent you and your wishes and your values. Even if sometimes you might not agree with that person and the decisions they're making, you voted for them because you believe overall that they represent you and they are like you and they have your best interest in heart. So a representative government is a government where elected officials make decisions for a country. I like to think of it as a triangle where at the base you have the people and they elect the government who then make decisions that affect the people. Theoretically, because you voted for this person, you will be happy with the decisions that they make for you. In the colonies, the people could vote for their colonial assembly, but they could not vote for the British Parliament, who were actually passing the majority of laws. The assemblies could make and did make laws, but the Parliament overruled those. And so they were not represented in British Parliament. And back to our umbrella, coming underneath representative government, and it probably would have been more effective if I'd depicted that in this image, is the idea of taxation without representation. And this is like the catch cry of the American Revolution. James Otis said it, Patrick Henry said it. It was the big idea that really sparked the revolution. And this is basically that the colonists were being taxed by an authority without electing that authority. And that is unfair, to have to pay people who you did not vote for because they believe it is best. But who is it best for? How can you trust that they have your interest in heart when you're not represented there? So it was an anti-British slogan that the colonies used in their revolution. And then our final one is little liberty. Now, when we hear liberty, we usually probably think freedom, and that is a perfect synonym. But what does it actually look like in a revolutionary context? So liberty and political liberty for the American colonists kind of is these four main ideas. It means that your natural rights should be protected. Obviously, one of the natural rights is liberty, so that seems a little bit doubly up, I'm not sure. But essentially, like, you are not free if your life, your liberty, or your estate are being challenged. So you have liberty if these are protected. You also have liberty if you have self-governance, which means you can make decisions for yourself, but also importantly, as a nation, you are making decisions for yourself. The 13 colonies, they weren't a country, but they did not have the ability to make their own decisions. They had to follow what the British Parliament said, so they did not have self-governance. A key feature of liberty, and this is again very particular to the American context, is the idea of economic individualism or autonomy. So individualism is the idea that you are independent. You don't rely on someone else. Autonomy, you can make your own decisions. So in this case, economic individualism is sort of basically capitalism, that in society you have the right to earn money and keep that money, and no one should try and take that from you. Obviously, America still has taxes today, but it is a big sticking point, and if we think about healthcare and how that's not really prevalent in America, that is because of this idea of economic individualism. And a lot of people argue that they should not have to pay money for someone else to receive healthcare. Whereas in Australia, we do pay taxes that benefit other people. But economic individualism is that you have the freedom or the liberty to make decisions about your money. There's nowhere in the world that doesn't have some form of tax, but it's just about to what degree that is and who gives you those tax. Obviously, if it's not someone you elect, you don't have that freedom of economic individualism. Finally, personal autonomy. So like I said, autonomy is just the right and ability to make decisions for yourself. So freedom is you can choose what you do with your life without being told what to do with your life. So to recap, liberty and freedom are very vague in terms of what they are, but when the revolutionaries were fighting for liberty, they were fighting for the protection of their natural rights, the ability to govern themselves and have a representative government of Americans, and the ability to not be taxed on things by people who were not represented by them. So again, liberty for the American colonists was protection of their rights, ability to have their own government, and be taxed with representation. So finally, this is just a little visual recap of all of the ideas that we've talked about in this video. So we have Enlightenment, which is the philosophical movement that sparked these other ideas. And so the first sort of ideas that came out from John Locke were the ideas that you have natural rights, the right to life, to liberty, and your property or estate. And under that comes liberty. Enlightenment philosophers also spoke and recommended republicanism as a form of government. So a government where people elect their leaders and there is no monarchy. And this kind of connects to the third idea of Enlightenment, which is that there should be representative government. And that a representative government looks like you voting for people who have your best interests, not you having to follow the laws of people who live hundreds of kilometers away and have no investment in your life other than taking money from you, which leads to taxation without representation. The colonists were being taxed by people who had never met them. Finally, it's not one of the ideas on the study design, but all of this kind of leads to, well, what is the purpose of monarchy? And what is the purpose of the British Empire for the colonists? And that's the question that they eventually ask that leads to the revolution.